Hello YouTube, welcome back to my playthrough of Black Ops 1. I hope that you guys are enjoying this. Hope you guys like the Vietnam cosplay I got for this. But we're gonna be doing the mission S.O.G on this part, which is also the Battle of Khe Sanh, and I'm gonna talk a lot of history on this part. So anyways, let's continue here, let's do it.
Did you believe that he would lead you to Dragovich?
Somehow I knew Dragovich was still alive.
He became your obsession. You spent the next 5 years trying to track him down.
He was everywhere! I couldn't get him out of my head. He's just like the others.
We pumped so much shit into him, he doesn't even know what he's saying.
Russians. Just always in my head.
No, I want to keep pressing him.
Hey! Who are you people? What do you want from me?
We want the numbers, Mason. That's all we've ever wanted. Take us back again, Mason. After Baikonur, where did Washington send you next?
Vietnam. Fucking Khe Sanh.
This was in 1968.
Yeah, I was part of the S.O.G unit led by Frank Woods. It was recon on covert Russian activity in Laos.
What about your CIA handler, Hudson? Was he in Khe Sanh? Do you remember him there?
Hudson. And Mr. Shades. The guy was an ice cube.
This is the psychedelic.
Oh, and on this part, I'm sorry to do this, guys. I'm gonna have to turn off the music on this part. I can turn it back on after the Fortunate Son plays, but it's really annoying because the Music Mafia will just claim the video, so they'll go after the video and claim it right away. So this is now 5 years later. Kennedy's been assassinated, 1968, January 21st.
Woods, he's here.
Mason,
Woods, you look like hammered shit.
like some kind for shit in the jungle. This is nah, baby.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Jason Hudson, CIA. Thank you for your time, Sergeant.
Right.
Also, here's a little backstory. The reason that Woods was ignoring Hudson, like when Hudson said CIA, Woods basically just like brushed him off and walked away. The reason for this is because the CIA is historically like one of the most hated government agencies in the United States. The most hated government agency in the United States is probably the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. They are the tax agency, for obvious reasons why the IRS are hated. But as for the CIA, one of the reasons that the CIA is so hated, especially by other government agencies, other parts of the armed forces, is because of the CIA's secrecy, the CIA's unwillingness to share anything with any other agency, and because of the CIA's arrogance and their constant attitude in demanding others help them but not helping others back. Like, for example, I'll tell you guys a story. My professor in college, I studied law enforcement technologies, what I got a bachelor's degree in. One of my professors in college, he was a former DEA agent, that's Drug Enforcement Administration. Now, there's a lot of people out there that think that the DEA was, like, involved with the cartels and, like, helping the cartels and, like, smuggling drugs for them. That's not really true. It was the CIA who did that. The CIA were the ones who were involved with the cartels. They were the ones who were involved with drug trafficking. They helped out a lot of the cartels, especially in the 80s and the 90s, in places like Nicaragua, for example, and then you had the crack epidemic, which happened in the 90s, which San Andreas' story with Torino is a huge part of that. But anyways, about that is that most DEA agents are good people, just like if you ever watched the series Breaking Bad, they're people like Hank, who just basically want to stop these cartels and stop these drug traffickers. It was the CIA who was mostly working with those, bad groups. But the reason that the CIA is so hated is because the CIA, what they will do is that they will interfere with another government agency. So they'll show up to the DEA and they'll demand that the DEA basically cooperate with them, and they'll basically tell the DEA, oh, give us this information on this cartel boss, tell us this, that, and the DEA has to give them all this. They have absolutely no choice whatsoever. And what happens is, when the DEA needs help and the CIA has some info they could use, and they're like, oh, can you help us? No. The CIA will never, ever help any other agency, but they will constantly demand help from other agencies. They will interfere in other agencies. It's extremely annoying. It's extremely frustrating. And also the part of the CIA is just secrecy, and a lot of the crap they do, the shady things they do, they're very, a lot of people don't have respect for them. Primarily because of that. And, and Woods is part of S.O.G, which is, Special Forces, a group in Vietnam. So, of course, they're not going to, they're not going to like the CIA. There was actually a story of a guy, I forget the guy's name. I'll actually have his name on the screen right now. But there was basically a guy who his friends were fighting in Vietnam. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to go visit his friends, and he wanted to give his friends, bring over his friends some beer. And what the guy basically did was he wore, a button shirt, shorts, and what he did was he flew to Vietnam. He flew to South Vietnam at the time, and when the U.S. military stopped him, they're like, what are you doing here? He basically said, I'm a tourist. And what he didn't realize is that when you say the word tourist, you mean that you're CIA. That was basically a term for saying CIA, and that's what the CIA would wear. The button shirts, shorts. That was what they wore. Like the typical thing that you would think the CIA wore, they wore it a lot. And so what happened was a lot of the military people didn't bother in stopping this guy, questioning him, because they thought he was CIA, and they thought that if he was a CIA agent and they questioned him, that he would make, get them fired from their positions, remove them, other stuff like that. But he wasn't a CIA agent. He was just, regular guy that brought over beers to his friends in South Vietnam. But that's basically it. That's the whole backstory and why the CIA is just so disliked. And there's also a saying that the CIA is basically the fourth branch of government. That's what a lot of Americans say, because it's just how much the CIA influences a lot of stuff. They interfere in a lot of stuff. Like, for example, the U.S. government recently released a lot of the JFK files, and a lot of people in the CIA were pushing for that stuff not to get released. Why exactly? You think about stuff like that. So, it's not up to them. They're just a federal agency. They're supposed to, follow orders. They're supposed to, respect whoever's in office, but not to really get involved in the politics. But, you see the CIA is trying to prevent stuff like that from being released. But anyways, let's continue on here.
I've already briefed Mason broadly about the situation.
Let me fill in the blanks for you. Back in '64, the CIA gave up control of covert operations in Southeast Asia, handed it over to the U.S. military. From that, S.O.G was born. Now, aside from being a base for the Marine Corps, Khe Sanh is our launching point for all cross-border activities, mostly Laos and Cambodia. Missions are S&D, sabotage, black propaganda, strategic recon, POW rescue. Usual shit.
Let me turn the music back on here, because we can have it back on now.
Mason, over here! We gotta move him! Get into the bunker, I'll cover you! Go!
Hudson was down and Khe Sanh was under siege. But like with Weaver, you risked your life to save him.
Hudson was a fucking ice cube. That's why I like the bastard.
Your mission priority was to get to Hue City, but you all stayed behind to defend Khe Sanh. That wasn't your objective.
You obviously didn't know Woods. You knew Khe Sanh needed our help. There's no decision to make.
Hudson. I'm okay.
Okay, so now on this part, I'm basically going to explain the Vietnam War, and I'm going to explain exactly what's going on here, including Battle of Khe Sanh. There's going to be probably a lot of explaining for me to do, a lot of coverage on this part. And also, I will say this, Vietnam War, it's a very controversial subject to discuss. I'm going to discuss the history to you, but I'm also going to tell you guys, as an American, I'm going to have bias as well, because I'm an American. So I'm going to have some personal bias on this, but I'm going to explain basically the Vietnam War and what's going on here exactly. So this basically starts in the beginning. The Vietnam War did not start with America entered the Vietnam War in 1965, but America did not start the Vietnam War. A lot of people think that America started the Vietnam War. Do you know who actually started the Vietnam War? It was actually France. That's people like France. Yeah, France was the ones who started the Vietnam War. What happened was the Vietnam War pretty much had started close to after World War II. So Vietnam was a colony of France. And what happened was during World War II, May 1940, the Germans had pushed into France, Nazis had occupied France. What the Nazis then did was they basically created a puppet government in southern France called Vichy France, which was a French fascist puppet state. And this government was now responsible for occupying Vietnam. So this new fascist puppet state were the new colonial authorities that were in Vietnam. Now, basically, fast forward, Nazis are defeated. U.S. helps to liberate France. A new French government forms. Now, the new government of France, what they tried to do, they tried to colonize Vietnam again. So they wanted Vietnam to be their colony. And at that time, Vietnam was technically a monarchy, but it was really a colony. And the monarchy at the time was Bao Dai, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He was the last monarch of Vietnam, and he's extremely hated by both communist Vietnamese and non-communist Vietnamese. So both, pretty much all Vietnamese people really don't like him. Now, why is he so disliked? He was basically a puppet king under the French. And what happened was when the Japanese occupied Vietnam in around March of 1945, and this was when the Vichy French government fell, and the Japanese thought that now was going to be a new French government was going to occupy Vietnam, and they decided to occupy it before that happened, and they put Bao Dai as the emperor again. So now he was a puppet for the Japanese. And what ended up happening is when the Japanese were defeated, the French came back, and the French tried to colonize Vietnam again, and this basically started the First Indochina War. Now, the French had put Bao Dai in power again. So he was, their puppet ruler of Vietnam, and the French were colonizing Vietnam. They were basically taking over the country, stealing Vietnam's natural resources, exploiting the country, colonialism, basically. And so everybody, all Vietnamese, virtually the vast majority of Vietnamese did not like the French. All of them, the communist Vietnamese, the non-communist Vietnamese, pretty much everyone. The only Vietnamese that had a little bit more favorable view of the French were the Catholic Vietnamese, but even a lot of the Catholic Vietnamese did not like the French either. The only reason they really sided with them was because they were scared of the communist Vietnamese that were in the north. So what happened was the French army, when they entered Vietnam, you had fierce resistance, and the worst resistance against the French was in North Vietnam. That's where the fiercest resistance was, and this later became the North Vietnamese communist state. Now, the primary people that fought against the French were the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh, this was a communist organization, a communist resistance group. This organization had its roots all the way back when they were fighting the Japanese. So they had also fought against the Japanese. They were experts in guerrilla warfare, and the French were not prepared for this at all. The French thought that by entering Vietnam, that people would think that they were liberating them from the previous Vichy occupation and the Japanese occupation. But the Vietnamese did not want anybody. They didn't want the Vichy French occupation. They didn't want the Japanese occupation, and they didn't want the French Republic occupation. They wanted their country to be independent. They didn't want the French to be there. And the Viet Minh was led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh, who later became, the first president of North Vietnam, also the general secretary of the Communist Party, and he was also the dictator of North Vietnam. Now, about Ho Chi Minh is, there's a lot of misinformation about him. I have read so many comments of people that talk about Ho Chi Minh, where they basically say, Ho Chi Minh admired America, and he wanted to model Vietnam based on, America, and the Americans betrayed him, and so he instead turned to the Soviets and the Chinese for help, which is half true. Basically is Ho Chi Minh always hated America, so he did not admire America. It is true, what is true is that Ho Chi Minh did model Vietnam's Declaration of Independence based on the American Declaration of Independence, where he says, I believe that Vietnam's Declaration of Independence is that all men are created equal, which is heavily, inspired by the American Declaration of Independence. So that is true that Vietnam's Declaration of Independence is modeled on or North Vietnam's Declaration of Independence is modeled on the American Declaration of Independence. But when you think about that line, all men are created equal, that's a really great line for really any country to use. So while it might have been modeled after the American Declaration of Independence, it doesn't mean that Ho Chi Minh admired America or liked America. Ho Chi Minh always hated America. Ho Chi Minh was a communist ever since his youth. So when Ho Chi Minh was young, he spent his youth in France. And when he lived in France, he was one of the founding members of the Communist Party of France. And what Ho Chi Minh ended up doing is he fled France, were scared that the French would arrest him, and he traveled to the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, he studied at a Soviet university. I forget the name of the Soviet university. I will actually put it down in the description, so in the bottom of the video there, so you guys can see. But he studied at a Soviet university. He was a communist in France in his youth. He fled France. He traveled to the Soviet Union. This was in the early 1920s. There's pictures of him with communist officials in the Soviet Union. And about Ho Chi Minh is Ho Chi Minh admired Stalin. He admired Stalin, he admired Lenin, he admired Marx. So when people say, oh, Ho Chi Minh became a communist because the Americans alienated him, that is not true. He was always a communist ever since his youth. He did not like the United States. And if you want to know how Ho Chi Minh actually fought in his youth, this is a perfect example. These are actually quotes and writing from Ho Chi Minh. I actually found a book about him. I'll have the source down below. But this is basically what Ho Chi Minh, the communist founder of North Vietnam, wrote. On January 6, 1930, our party came into being. After the success of the Russian October Revolution, Lenin promoted the setting up of the Communist International. And the Communist International, that was basically an organization the Soviet Union promoted in order to spread communism and promote communist revolutions in other countries. Since that time, the international proletariat, the proletariat is a reference to the working class, so the Soviets would always say that. And the World Revolution have become a great family, and our party is one of its youngest members. Marx, Engels, and Lenin and Stalin are the common teachers for the World Revolution. Comrade Mao Zedong has successfully synthesized the ideology of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin correctly, applied it to the practical situation of China, and has led the Chinese Revolution to complete victory. So right here, in Ho Chi Minh's own writings, he admires Stalin and he admires Mao. Stalin and Mao are some of the worst mass murderers in human history. And Mao Zedong has a kill count of close to 60 million people that he killed. And so you got somebody like Ho Chi Minh that is admiring both Stalin and Mao. Stalin, over 30,000 prison camps. Millions of people died in his prison camps. Mao Zedong, responsible for one of the worst famines in history. Millions dead. Owing to the geographical, historical, economic, and cultural conditions, the Chinese Revolution exerted a great influence on the Vietnamese Revolution, which had to learn and indeed has learned many experiences from it. Thanks to the experiences of the Chinese Revolution and to Mao Zedong's thoughts, we have further understood the ideology of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, and consequently scored many successes. This, the Vietnamese revolutionaries must engrave on their minds and be grateful for. Right there, this is what he thinks of Stalin and Mao. Now, to be fair, I did find a quote where he did criticize Stalin in that same book. He wrote, in speaking of the cult of the individual, we should have a balanced view with regard to Comrade Stalin. Comrade Stalin made many great contributions to the revolution, but he also made serious mistakes. There is one quote criticizing him, but then we also have this other thing. The October Revolution was victorious. The building of socialism in the Soviet Union has been successful. The Chinese Revolution has been successful. These great successes have opened the way to success for our revolution and that of many other countries in the world. So, literally, Ho Chi Minh wanted to promote communist revolutions in other countries. That's not his business. It's not his business to interfere in other countries' affairs, but he wanted to promote basically communist revolutions in other nations. We have a great and powerful party. It's great and powerful thanks to Marxism-Leninism, to the constant efforts of all our party members, and to the love, confidence, and support of our army and people as a whole. We have the most clear-sighted and worthy elder brothers and friends of mankind, Comrade Stalin and Comrade Mao Zedong. The best friend, worthy elder brothers and friends of mankind, Stalin and Mao. That's what he says. That is why I am convinced that we will fulfill the following heavy but glorious task: to found a most powerful party, the Vietnam Workers' Party, to carry out the resistance till complete victory, to build a new democratic Vietnam, to contribute to the defense of democracy in the world and a lasting peace. Now, about Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was not as brutal as Mao, Stalin, or Pol Pot. Pol Pot, who was a dictator of Cambodia near Vietnam. So he wasn't as brutal and as psychotic as those other three dictators, but he was a dictator nonetheless. And he admired people like Mao, he admired people like Stalin. So this idea, when I hear people saying all the time that they say that that Ho Chi Minh admired America and then America betrayed him and then he became a communist. No, he was always a communist ever since his youth. He did not like the U.S. He never liked the U.S. And additionally, there's actually pictures of Ho Chi Minh that you can find in 1945 where he's actually with a bunch of OSS agents. The OSS are the Office of Strategic Services. They were the precursors to the CIA. So the OSS later became the CIA. The OSS was made during World War II to in covert operations against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And the OSS helped him out a lot. So he received a lot of medical aid from the OSS. He received food, weapons, training. The OSS helped him a lot against the Japanese. So when Ho Chi Minh was fighting against the Japanese in Vietnam, OSS helped him out a lot. And OSS even treated him for malaria. So when Ho Chi Minh got sick, the OSS actually treated him for that. So basically, the point that I'm getting at right here is that Ho Chi Minh was not some pro-American, guy that was betrayed by the U.S. and then he basically said, oh, screw the U.S., I'm going to become a communist now. He was always a communist. He always disliked the U.S. The reason that he took aid from the U.S. is because the U.S. was not Britain or France, which he heavily disliked. He didn't like the U.S. As well, but he disliked Britain and France much more than he disliked the U.S. And so it was aid. He was getting aid. He was fighting against the Japanese. The reason that we helped Ho Chi Minh, we knew that he was a communist when we were helping him. The reason that we helped him is because it's the idea. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was just like we helped Stalin. We helped Stalin because he was our ally, helping us to fight against the Nazis, who we had a common enemy. So basically, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we were fighting against the Imperial Japanese. That was our main priority, and so we helped Ho Chi Minh. And basically, at the same time, when you think about it, Stalin wanted aid from the U.S. He got a lot of aid in the Lend-Lease program. Does that mean that Stalin admired the U.S. because he asked the U.S. for aid? Not necessarily. So that's basically about Ho Chi Minh. And when Ho Chi Minh came to power, he talks about democracy here, but when he came to power, he outlawed all parties. At the opposition arrested any party that was it was not pro-Communist Party of Vietnam was arrested and banned. And the Communist Party of Vietnam was pretty much the only party that was allowed in North Vietnam. And so there's a lot of communist propaganda out there where they will say, for example, that South Vietnam was a dictatorship, which South Vietnam, to be fair, was a dictatorship, but at the same time, is what the communists tend to ignore is they tend to ignore that North Vietnam was very much a dictatorship and Ho Chi Minh had pretty much banned all political parties. So that's basically the reality of Ho Chi Minh. Now, going back to the first Indochina War, what happened exactly is Ho Chi Minh, led the Viet Minh, and they had fought against the French, and the French. It was a disaster for them. It was a disaster. France lost that conflict. And in 1954, France basically admitted defeat. They realized that it was not worth it. They were not prepared for the jungle warfare in Vietnam. They lost. And how basically the war ended was there was the 1954 Geneva Agreement. And what happened in that agreement was that there was supposed to be a demilitarized zone. And the demilitarized zone basically spread North Vietnam and South Vietnam along the 17th parallel. That's basically where the two countries got split. So Vietnam at that time, after the First Indochina War, became two countries. You had North Vietnam, communist state, and then you had Republic of Vietnam in the south, which Republic of South Vietnam was a dictatorship also, but I'll get to that in a little bit too. But that's basically how Vietnam had been split apart. Now, what happened was that there were supposed to be free movement of people between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So if you were a South Vietnamese and you wanted to go live in North Vietnam, the South Vietnamese were supposed to let you go live there. If you were North Vietnamese and you wanted to go live in South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese were supposed to let you go live there. And what happened was 1 million North Vietnamese actually traveled from North Vietnam to settle into South Vietnam. And the U.S. actually used this as propaganda as well. And so American ships had actually taken a lot of these North Vietnamese refugees. A lot of the North Vietnamese refugees were Catholics, and they took them and settled them into South Vietnam. So, and this is the part that the communists will ignore. This is the part that they won't really talk to you about history with this in this regard. That over 1 million North Vietnamese actually went to South Vietnam. So, yes, there was communists that actually, entered, from South Vietnam that went to go live in North Vietnam. But the amount of people that left North Vietnam versus people from South Vietnam entering North Vietnam, it was a lot higher people fleeing North Vietnam. So you have this where lots of people in history will flee communist countries. They won't, people aren't going to mass immigrate to communist countries. It's almost always the other way around, where people are, mass leaving communist countries. And what happened was, if you lived in the cities, if you lived in cities in Vietnam near the ports, it was a lot easier for you to leave. But even though the agreement said that if there was supposed to be free travel of people for 300 days, what happened was the Viet Minh actually tried to stop a lot of people from actually leaving North Vietnam. So that was That was basically it. And there was an International Control Commission that was set up, and the International Control Commission was basically a group of countries that was supposed to help with administering peace in Vietnam. And this was made up of Canada, Poland, and India. And the reason that these three countries were chosen, it was Canada was a Western capitalist nation that was chosen. Poland was a communist nation, and India was a non-aligned nation. India was part of the non-aligned movement, which meant that they were not aligned with either the West or the Soviet Union, though India was a little bit more pro-Soviet Union, but it was part of the non-aligned movement. So you had those three countries, but it was, even though I'm a Polish American, it was a mistake having Poland on that, because Poland was basically a puppet of the Soviet Union at that time, so it was a mistake. If they wanted to have a communist country on that, as part of the International Control Commission, they should have had Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a neutral communist country. It was not a puppet of the Soviet Union. So if they wanted to have a communist country, part of that, commission, it should have been Yugoslavia instead of Poland, because Poland was basically a puppet of the Soviet Union. Wherever the Soviet Union told Poland to do, they would do it. So basically, it was to make it seem like it was Poland acting on its own like that, but they were basically just controlled by the Soviet Union in that commission. Basically, another huge part of this agreement was that there was actually supposed to be elections held in July 1956. Those elections were actually canceled by South Vietnam, which I'll get to in a little bit. So what happened is Bao Dai, the Vietnamese emperor, ended up becoming emperor of South Vietnam for about a year. And what happened was you had a nationalist figure, and the nationalist figure, his name was Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, Ngo Dinh Diem, he was resistant to the French, so he wasn't necessarily pro-French, which that's what a lot of Vietnamese people liked him for. But Diem was a pretty controversial figure in Vietnamese history. So Diem was offered a position to actually be a leader, a prime minister of Japanese-occupied Vietnam. He refused it. I think that later he regretted that. But then he, what he did was he reached out to Bao Dai and he told Bao Dai, make me prime minister of, South Vietnam. Now, Bao Dai and Ngo Dinh Diem, they really hated each other. They didn't like each other, but the reason that Bao Dai, the emperor, made him the prime minister of South Vietnam was because because Bao Dai knew that his popularity was really bad. He knew that the majority of Vietnamese hated him, and he thought that by making this guy prime minister, that would help him with his popularity. Now, what ended up happening was a year later after this, there was actually a referendum. He was the prime minister of South Vietnam, and he called for this referendum. And this referendum was to decide if you want to abolish the monarchy or not. And it was, do you want South Vietnam to be a republic? Now, the U.S. had supported Ngo Dinh Diem in this referendum. The U.S. basically supported abolishing the monarchy and making South Vietnam into a republic. And the thing is, if Bao Dai refused this referendum, he could have had riots in the streets because of just the fact that how unpopular he was as an emperor. Like I said, majority of Vietnamese people hated him. But if he went along with this, he would be abdicated. Now, what ended up happening is Bao Dai agreed to the referendum. The referendum was held. And when it comes to referendum, this referendum was rigged. And here's the really weird thing about this. And so this is going to confuse people a lot about this. The Ngo Dinh Diem, knew that he would win the referendum. So he knew that the monarchy would be abolished in Vietnam. But he still rigged the referendum in his favor. So now you're probably wondering, if Ngo Dinh Diem knew that he would win the referendum regardless, why would he still rig it in his favor? Why? Well, the answer is pretty simple. The answer is because he wanted to show that how much people hated the monarchy, and he wanted to solidify his power. If he had an overwhelming vote to abolish the monarchy, that would justify him giving himself more power as prime minister. So it was a way basically to give himself more power. So even though if this referendum was fair, he still would have won. The monarchy would have still been abolished. But the reason that he rigged it was to show that there was more people that hated the monarchy than there actually was, in order to basically give himself more power as a prime minister. And he became president later. Now, how do we know that the referendum was rigged? The reason that we know that the referendum was rigged was because there was about 5,335,668 people that were eligible to vote. But the final vote, there was 5,784,752 people. So where did that extra 400,000 people come from? So it was clearly rigged. And if you look at the final tally, it was like 98% of people wanted the monarchy abolished. So the monarchy was very unpopular, but I don't know if I would say it was 98% of people that wanted the monarchy abolished. Maybe it would have been closer to maybe 80%, 85%, maybe in the 70s. We won't know the true number because it was rigged. The only thing we know is that the monarchy would have been abolished regardless. But he made the number 98% in order to solidify his power and give himself, more power. Now, when he became the president of South Vietnam, he was a dictator. So, Ngo Dinh Diem was a dictator of South Vietnam for the next 8 years. He was dictator until 1963. Now, about him, what was he like as a dictator? He was a lot of Vietnamese people, early on, he was pretty popular. So when Ngo Dinh Diem came to power as prime minister, he was pretty popular. People saw him as an outsider. They saw him as somebody who didn't like the monarchy, which, again, the monarchy was hated. And so he got some popularity early on. He did not cooperate with the French. He was not a fan of the French. So that also gave him more popularity. But what was Ngo Dinh Diem's biggest mistake? His biggest mistake was that he wasn't a Vietnamese nationalist, which is what the majority of the Vietnamese people wanted, a nationalist as their leader. He wasn't a nationalist. A lot of people call him a Vietnamese nationalist, but I wouldn't call him a Vietnamese nationalist. He was a Catholic nationalist. And there's a very big difference between a nationalist and a Catholic nationalist. A nationalist is somebody who likes their country and is going to generally do what's best for their country. There are authoritarian nationalists, dictators, but then there's also, democratic nationalists who want to just do what's best for their country. But he was a Catholic nationalist. What a Catholic nationalist is somebody who basically mixes nationalism with a religion, which is an extremely toxic form of government. Like, religious nationalism is one of the most toxic forms of government. And and making himself a Catholic nationalist was one of the stupidest things he did, following Catholic nationalist policies. And the reason for this is because Vietnam was not a majority Catholic nation. Correct me if I'm wrong, some of my Vietnamese viewers. I think that Vietnam was like 60-70% Buddhist. I know that the majority of the religion was Buddhism in Vietnam. And so a lot of Catholic Vietnamese had actually come and lived in South Vietnam, which helped with Diem's popularity. But this was also, at the same time, what this was doing is this was making the Buddhist, majority feel like crap. Basically, the government pursuing like a policy of religion, saying, Catholicism is the only true religion and discriminating against any other religion. So this made the Buddhists, feel terrible. They were being discriminated. And so there was Buddhists, when Buddhists would protest against Diem's regime, they were arrested, sometimes brutally killed. Like, there was police in the streets that would actually shoot Buddhist monks. You had the Buddhist, crisis later on, where there was an uprising of Buddhists against Diem's government. So that was one of the worst things that Diem did, is just those authoritarian religious policies that he put in. He basically treated the Buddhists like crap. The Buddhists reacted violently. It was really bad. And North Vietnam used this as propaganda. Even though North Vietnam was a state atheist country, so North Vietnam only recognized atheism as really the only religion. Today, the Buddhists in Vietnam are treated better by the North Vietnamese government, but the North Vietnamese government only saw state atheism as the only really recognized religion. So that's another thing that people aren't telling you. But even though there was state atheism, the North Vietnamese government used this as propaganda, and they would say, South Vietnam is, treating the Buddhists like crap. If we were in power, we would treat the Buddhists a lot better, which is to a degree. The Buddhists were being treated really badly by the South Vietnamese, but the North Vietnamese were doing this primarily just for their propaganda victory. And so Diem also appointed his brothers to high positions in the government. And this was also seen as massive corruption. Now, what ended up happening is in 1963, there was a coup against Diem. And the U.S. had supported the coup. And the reason that the U.S. had supported the coup was because they were scared that he was really alienating the Buddhist majority. And the Buddhist crisis got so out of control that there was actually Buddhist monks that were actually killing themselves in the streets to protest against him. There's actually a famous picture of a Buddhist monk that actually set himself on fire, like in the middle of a busy street in Saigon, which later was renamed the Ho Chi Minh. So this, and that was basically the world waking up to seeing how Diem was heavily mistreating the Buddhist monks. So the U.S. had supported the coup. It was a bunch of generals that were basically pissed off against Diem's reign. They had these generals had overthrown him, and then Diem was basically shot. So he was overthrown. I think Diem was shot while he was being transported, but he was executed. So Diem was executed, and what ended up happening is the next 4 years, Vietnam was basically ruled by a military junta. What a military junta basically is, it's a dictatorship, but instead of being a dictatorship controlled by one person, it's controlled by a series of generals. So for the next, 4 years, South Vietnam was basically controlled by a bunch of generals. And then 4 years later, they had another election, but that president was basically a puppet of the generals again at the same time. Now, what was happening also was that North Vietnam, for years, was taking advantage of the instability that was going on in South Vietnam. And what they were doing is in North Vietnam were funding the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were a terrorist organization. They were a dangerous group of mostly South Vietnamese communists, though some of them were from Cambodia, but they were mostly South Vietnamese communists. And the Viet Cong had done really horrible things. They had committed numerous atrocities against people. They were responsible for terrorist attacks. And even years before the U.S. actually fully got involved in the Vietnam War, what happened was the Viet Cong were committing acts. They were bombing schools. They were executing priests in the street. They were killing anybody that they suspected of being in league with the government. So even if you were related to somebody that was in the government, your entire family would be targeted by the Viet Cong. And North Vietnam was funding that insurgency that was going on. Now, at this same time, JFK, when JFK was president in 1961, what happened was JFK sent advisors to Vietnam. And it started out with a few hundred American advisors to basically train the South Vietnamese army and get the South Vietnamese army ready to fight the North. It increased over time, and JFK ended up sending over 10,000 American advisors. Now, why? I'll get into why America was so obsessed with Vietnam in a little bit here. But basically, America was sending a bunch of advisors to train the South Vietnamese, getting them ready to fight against the North Vietnamese. Now, eventually, this spilled into full-scale fighting, and North Vietnam was in open warfare against South Vietnam. Now, North Vietnam had claimed a bunch of reasons for attacking South Vietnam. What North Vietnam had claimed is that North Vietnam claimed that South Vietnam was violating the 1954, Geneva Agreement. And one of the things in the 1954 Geneva Agreement was that South Vietnam was to have elections with North Vietnam together. So there were supposed to be, big elections with the country, and it was supposed to be that commission of Poland, Canada, and India was supposed to oversee to make sure that there was fair, elections, and that nobody was rigging anything. Now, South Vietnam, the reason that South Vietnam refused to host the elections was because South Vietnam claimed they never signed the elections, or signed the agreement, but the French government that was occupying South Vietnam, that South Vietnam kind of agreed with at the time, there was kind of a joint government right after the end of the war. They basically, that the French government promised that South Vietnam would adhere to those rules. And the second reason is that Diem had basically claimed, when he was still alive, Diem had claimed that the North Vietnamese, the communists, were not going to respect the election, and they were going to rig it. Which, to be fair, I'm not defending Diem. He was a brutal dictator, but Diem does have a point here that the communists would not have respected a free election. If there was an election between, the North and the South, the communists would have rigged all of the elections in the North, and the South, to be fair, South Vietnam would have rigged all the elections in the South. So there was no way that a free election was going to happen. So, and even with Poland, India, and Canada being there, Poland, India, and Canada would not have the resources to check for that much electoral fraud. Because, like I said, both countries, South Vietnam would be doing so much fraud, there would be so much, they would be rigging the elections, and North Vietnam at the same time would be rigging the elections. So there was really no chance of a free election happening in Vietnam. So that's what Diem said. Diem did rig his own elections, but he was right that the communists would also rig elections. And if you look at communist countries historically have rigged a lot of elections. It's happened a lot. And if you look at, for example, Eastern Europe, Stalin promised that there would be free elections in, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. But what Stalin did was he instead rigged all of those elections and then had anybody arrested who was from the opposition. So communists don't respect free elections, and they have there's been a history of communist countries that have just rigged elections. Now, so North Vietnam had basically claimed that, that South Vietnam was violating that. And North Vietnam, what they were also claiming is there was a part of the Geneva Agreement that claimed that both North Vietnam and South Vietnam could not seek military alliances with other countries and could not accept military aid from other countries. And North Vietnam was claiming that, South Vietnam was violating this, so we had the right to attack. They were, in an alliance with the United States, and the United States was sending advisors and weapons, which it is true, South Vietnam was violating an agreement by, being in an alliance with the United States. But what they don't tell you, this is the part what the communists aren't telling you, that North Vietnam was violating that agreement just as much as South Vietnam was. So you see how communists will spin this? They will basically accuse South Vietnam of what they are doing also themselves. So they're accusing South Vietnam of violating the agreement by being in an alliance with the United States, taking military aid from the United States, but they're doing the same thing. What the North Vietnam was doing, North Vietnam was funded mostly by China and the Soviet Union. So it was two communist countries, the Soviet Union and China, both funding them, both training their military. Then where do you think North Vietnam got all their SKSs and AK-47s from? You think they just made them out of nowhere? No, they got them from China and the Soviet Union. So that was so China and the Soviet Union were funding North Vietnam as well. And not only that, North Vietnam was also funding terrorists. North Vietnam was funding, communists from the Viet Cong, and these communists in the Viet Cong were committing attacks in South Vietnam, and then the North Vietnamese would say, oh, we had nothing to do with that, when it was clear that they were funding the Viet Cong. It was obvious that the North Vietnamese were training and funding the Viet Cong. So North Vietnam was violating that agreement just as much as South Vietnam was violating it. But that's the part of history people don't tell you. They act like South Vietnam was violating all these agreements, but they ignore the part that North Vietnam was also violating a lot of these agreements. Now, moving on to the U.S., the U.S. got involved in the Vietnam War. The U.S. got involved in the Vietnam War with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the Gulf of Tonkin incident, I know people are going to say in the comments, people are going to say it was a cover-up. You are basically right, it was a cover-up. But what the Gulf of Tonkin is more like half a cover-up, like half of it is cover-up. I'll explain what's real and what's not. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, that happened in, I think it was 1964 when it happened. And it was off of the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water that's to the right side of Vietnam. Now, what happened was there were South Vietnamese commandos that were doing raids in the North Vietnam. North Vietnam was getting pissed about this. And what ended up happening was the U.S. actually sent one of their battleships, the Maddox, I think it was called, it was with an M. I'll have it down below. But the U.S. basically sent this battleship in order to spy on North Vietnam and sent it in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, the U.S. claimed that the Gulf of Tonkin was international waters. North Vietnam claimed that it was North Vietnamese waters. What ended up happening was a few torpedo boats had saw the U.S. battleship, and they had fired torpedoes at the U.S. battleship. Now, all these torpedoes missed. The U.S. battleship also fired a few warning shots. It was the warning shots were fired first. So the U.S. battleship fired the warning shots. The North Vietnamese torpedo boats fired a bunch of torpedoes. All the torpedoes missed. Then what ended up happening was the U.S. actually sent a few fighter jets into the area, and I think they actually sunk the torpedo boats, and I think a few of the North Vietnamese soldiers ended up dying in that. That was on August 2nd, 1964 is when that happened. August 4th, 1964, the U.S. government claimed that there was a second attack. They claimed that there was more torpedo boats attacking the U.S. ships. But that second attack did not happen. That's the part that's covered up. The first attack on August 2nd, even North Vietnam admits to it. Vietnam admits that that happened. The second attack did not happen. So the first attack, August 2nd, happened. The second attack was a cover-up, and it was primarily so that the U.S. would have an excuse to enter the Vietnam War, saying our ships were getting attacked. And at the same time, too, the U.S. government probably sent that ship in there hoping that it would happen. They probably did that. They were hoping to provoke North Vietnam, and that's probably one of the reasons that the American ship was there. So they did kind of use that as an excuse to get involved in the Vietnam War. Now, what ended up happening is the Lyndon B. Johnson was the president at this time. Kennedy was assassinated. He was, Kennedy's vice president. He took power after Kennedy died. Now, Lyndon B. Johnson had passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is one of the stupidest laws ever in American history. And what the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution basically was, it was a law that said that the U.S. could interfere in, the Vietnam War, could send troops into the Vietnam War, and this would not be a declaration of war. So in order to, for the U.S. to typically send troops, there needs to be a declaration of war. But Johnson got around this by basically passing this act. And what ended up happening is later on, they actually started drafting people. And the worst thing one of the worst things the U.S. did in the Vietnam War was the draft. The draft was such a stupid thing, because if the U.S. wanted to actually, go into Vietnam and fight the communists, and help South Vietnam, they should have done this with an all-volunteer force. But doing this with, draftees, that was stupid, because what happened is, if you went to college, you were a lot less likely to be drafted. So if you were like a working class person, you didn't go to college, you were a lot more likely to get drafted. So there was a lot of people that just went to college and would just lie about their degrees simply because simply so that they would not get drafted. So I think that the draft was, a mistake. I think the draft was personally stupid. And you cannot I can understand drafting people if the United States is getting invaded by somebody, like the Soviet Union comes to the US and they're invading us, we need to raise an army. But if you're sending people over across the ocean to a country that barely anybody knows anything about, I think that's a stupid. And so people, kids who just finished high school, who are just about to start up their lives, and you're drafting them and you're sending them over to fight a conflict that they pretty much know nothing about. So that's basically that. It was the draft was just a stupid, dumb thing ever. Now moving on to Vietnam, the U.S. fully entered the Vietnam War in 1965. That's basically when the U.S. fully entered the war. And about the Vietnam War, again, I'm going to tell you guys basically a lot of what's true and what's not true. Now, you guys have probably heard people say about the Vietnam War, they say that the U.S. dropped more bombs on, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, so the Indochina area. The U.S. dropped more bombs in that area than they did in World War II on Japan and Germany. Is that true? Yes, it is true. The U.S. did drop more bombs on Indochina during the Vietnam War than they did on Japan and Germany combined. But here's the thing is, there's some things that they're not telling you about this. So basically, the U.S. dropped about 2.15 million tons of bombs on Germany and Japan and Italy during World War II. In the Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, the U.S. dropped a total of 7.5 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Now, this is what people aren't telling you about this, and I'll have a picture of the map on the screen right here. This map right here, and I'll also have the source for it down below. This map basically shows the black dots are everywhere that the U.S. bombed during the Vietnam War. If you look at the map very carefully, you will see that North Vietnam is largely not being targeted. So the reason that the U.S. did not bomb North Vietnam was because the U.S. was basically scared of another Korean War happening. So during the Korean War, the U.S. actually invaded North Korea after North Korea invaded South Korea, and China was basically warning the U.S. and told the U.S. stay away from the border. The U.S. didn't listen, and then China sent over 1 million troops, and we got into a war with China, and the Korean War really escalated at that point. And we were scared of another repeat like that. We were scared of another war with China, and so we did not want that. So that is primarily why the U.S. did not strike North Vietnam the most, and the U.S. did not invade North Vietnam throughout the conflict. So we didn't invade North Vietnam. There was some skirmishes and battles that led into North Vietnam. We did have a bombing campaign of North Vietnam, but we largely did not invade North Vietnam because we were scared of the Chinese responding. Now, the reason that about the bombings here is that here's what people are not telling you about the bombings. If you look at the map again, if you look at where the bombings are happening along the border of Vietnam and Laos. What people don't tell you is that North Vietnam actually invaded Laos. So Laos was a monarchy that was a dictatorship, but North Vietnam actually invaded Laos. I think it was 1958 or 59. I have it up on the screen. But this is the thing is, America is called imperialist constantly for getting involved in the Vietnam War. But why is North Vietnam not called imperialist for attacking South Vietnam? And why is North Vietnam not called whenever you say that North Vietnam is imperialist for attacking South Vietnam, people will basically say to you that they'll say, oh, it was their own country, so they can't be imperialist. They were liberating their country. But what about Laos? Laos is not Vietnamese. So is that not imperialism when, North Vietnam had invaded, Laos? Well, the reason that North Vietnam invaded Laos was so that they could build the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is a series of roads through the jungle and also tunnels in which they would basically move weapons. And that's how they would basically flank the U.S. They would basically get around the U.S. They would go through Laos. They would go through parts of Cambodia. And they would basically hit the U.S. in the sides through the jungles. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Vietnam basically invaded Laos in order to use that trail primarily to invade South Vietnam. And that's why that area was just so bombed. Another reason for the bombings is that in World War II, when the U.S. was bombing, Japan and Germany and Italy during World War II, the U.S. knew what we were hitting. For the most part, we knew what we were hitting. We knew the Japanese factories, the Nazi factories. We knew where that stuff was. We knew where the Nazi cities were. We knew where the Japanese cities were. We knew where that stuff was, and so we were hitting that directly. When it comes to Vietnam, we didn't know where a lot of the North Vietnamese military was, and the reason, the jungles, the terrain was just so different. There was mountains, there was jungles, and so we did not know where the North Vietnamese were. That's why we did so many bombing campaigns. That's why they used napalm. Which napalm was a pretty horrible weapon. It was basically a bomb that would drop and would just incinerate an entire area. And that was why napalm was used in the jungles, for stuff like that. They also had Agent Orange, which Agent Orange was actually, a pesticide that the U.S. had basically dropped in the Vietnam War, and the idea of it was that it was going to kill all the trees and everything like that, and it was going to make it a lot easier for the U.S. to see the enemy. But the U.S. promised that it would not do damage to the environment. It did do damage to the environment, and what it did was the Agent Orange got so many Vietnamese people sick, and it got so many American soldiers sick. There are American soldiers that have died from cancer and are still sick to this day because they got contaminated by Agent Orange. So that's why the U.S. had dropped more bombs on the Indochina area than in World War II. It was a combination of factors. It was the jungles. They didn't know where the enemy was, so they were basically just bombing the jungles like crazy, hoping to hit the enemy. A lot of innocent civilians died in this also. The U.S. killed a lot of innocent civilians by just bombing the jungles. And they didn't know where the enemy was. The war had also lasted for 10 years. The U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War for 10 years. By 1969, U.S. presence had dropped. 71 to 73, almost all U.S. forces were out of Vietnam, but we still had helped them with air support. So the U.S. was in Vietnam for longer. We didn't know where the enemy targets were. Like in World War II, we knew where the enemy targets were. And the third thing is, Germany. Here's the thing. Germany would have gotten bombed even more than Vietnam during during the Vietnam War. So Germany would have gotten bombed more than Vietnam did during the Vietnam War if Germany did not have flak. What people aren't telling you is they're not telling you that Germany had the best anti-air system during World War II. They had the flak guns. The flak guns were extremely effective. Flaks, would just fire those shells up in the air. It would explode, and these fragments would just tear apart bombers. Like even a small hit from a flak cannon will rip apart an American bomber, rip apart an American flying fortress. So a lot of American planes had not and Americans typically, the British like to do bombing missions at night. Americans didn't typically like to do bombing missions at night. We wanted to have a more clear view of the target, and so we flew in the daytime. And a lot of our planes were shot down. Hundreds of American planes were shot down. So basically, if Germany did not have that flak system during World War II, they would have gotten bombed a lot more. So those flak guns were extremely effective. Now, when we compare this to Vietnam, Vietnam had almost no anti-air. They had nothing, nothing like the flak guns. They had no surface-to-air missile launchers. They didn't have that. Now, why didn't Vietnam have any anti-air? Now think about it. If Vietnam doesn't have any anti-air, of course, they're going to get bombed a lot because they have no way to shoot down the American planes who are dropping the bombs. Vietnam didn't really have any attack helicopters. They had a few fighter jets, but they didn't really have any attack helicopters, and they didn't have any anti-air. The reason that Vietnam did not have that much anti-air, when Vietnam did have anti-air, it was mostly like old style, like machine guns, typically like anti-aircraft weapons that they had during World War II. They didn't have something like a Soviet surface-to-air missile systems. The reason that they didn't have surface-to-air missile systems is because if the Soviets were trying to maintain that they were not involved in the Vietnam War, even though they were. So the Soviets, to maintain denial, would give the Vietnamese things like, like older tank models like T-34s, and, AK-47s, SKSs, which the Soviets could relatively deny for that. So like when it came to SKSs, AK-47s, tanks, the Soviets could say, oh, it was the Chinese. It wasn't us who gave them. But if the North Vietnamese start using Soviet surface-to-air missiles, which were pretty advanced, the Soviet missiles were pretty advanced at that time. If the Vietnamese started using that, then literally the Soviets could not have denied that they were directly aiding the North Vietnamese. So that's primarily why the North Vietnamese did not have any anti-air, because the Soviets would not give them, surface-to-air missile launchers. But that is basically it. Now, as for why was the U.S. so obsessed with Vietnam? Why were we so interested in that region? I know people are going to ask me that question. The reason that we were so obsessed with Vietnam is because we believed in the domino theory. And what the domino theory basically was this idea that if one country fell to communism, all the other countries would soon fall to communism. Like it was just a reaction. One country would fall, and then the communists in that country would spread communism in the other country and fund communist revolutions in the other country, and it would just keep going on and on and on until the whole world would fall to communism. And when you think about it, the domino theory isn't really a theory, it's more of a fact. Because if you look at, like, for example, like Indochina, it did happen exactly like the U.S. was basically scared that if Vietnam fell to communism, all the surrounding countries would fall to communism. And it did happen. Vietnam fell to communism, and Cambodia fell to communism, and Laos fell to communism. So you had 3 countries that fell to communism in that region, and it was a direct result of the Vietnam War. So it is true to a degree that if a communist revolution happens in one country, it's really likely to spread to another country. Communists believe in international revolution. They want to spread the revolution all around the world. So that is That's a concern. The British actually had their own version of the Vietnam War where they had the Malayan Emergency, and the Malayan Emergency was kind of imperialist, where the British were supporting a puppet government in Malaysia, but they were fighting against communists in Malaysia. And if the communists ended up taking power in Malaysia, that would have been probably really, really bad. Not just for the West, but also for Malaysia. But what ended up happening is the British ended up winning in Malaysia, and they were protecting the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca is it's a body of water that's between Indonesia and Malaysia. And the U.S. was basically scared because we had, think about it. China was a communist state. North Korea was a communist state. North Vietnam was a communist state. We were scared Southeast Asia would then follow communism. Malaysia would follow communism. Indonesia could follow communism. And then the communists would control the Strait of Malacca. They would control all the water ports in that area. And they would basically blackmail the U.S. And so, they would control huge amounts of the global trade with that. So that's one of the reasons that we were so obsessed with Vietnam, is we were basically scared that this would disrupt trade in Southeast Asia, and that this would basically spread communism everywhere. That's why we were so obsessed with Vietnam. That's why we had gone into Vietnam. Now, should the U.S. have... Now, I know, some people are in the comments are going to accuse me, do you support the Vietnam War? I don't think that we should have really gone in there. I think maybe it was probably a mistake. My personal opinion on the matter is that if the U.S. wanted to go and help South Vietnam, I don't really have a problem with that. But if we were to help South Vietnam, it should have been a volunteer force. If we wanted to go into Vietnam and help South Vietnam, it should have been an all-volunteer force. It should not have been a draft, army. That was stupid because so many people had their lives destroyed. So many people had their lives ruined. People, came back without missing arms and legs. Other people died. So it was, so many young people that had, lost their lives. So if we wanted to get involved in the Vietnam War, it should have been an all-volunteer force. It should not have been a force, a draft army. How did the U.S. end up losing the Vietnam War? We were there for several years, and what ended up happening is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was repealed in 1971, and so the United States could not constantly keep sending troops into South Vietnam during the conflict. What ended up happening was the U.S. and South Vietnam and North Vietnam ended up signing the Paris Peace Accords. And the Paris Peace Accords basically said that fighting would stop, there would be a ceasefire, there would be negotiations, and all American troops were to withdraw. And the U.S. kept their word in the agreement. We withdrew all of our troops. By 1973, all of our troops were gone. We were not there anymore. Now, who broke the agreement? North Vietnam. North Vietnam broke the agreement. Hostilities started almost immediately after the U.S. had left, and then in 1975, Saigon fell, and that was the fall of Saigon. It was a disaster, and this is the part of history that a lot of people don't talk about. Is they don't talk about the Vietnamese people that had basically lost everything when the communists came to power. So there was people that had owned farms, businesses that were in their families for generations. The communists came in, they took everything. They made all the land property of the government. There was no more private industry left. And people lost their livelihoods, their jobs. And if somebody was with the South Vietnamese government, or if you had family members that were with the South Vietnamese government, you'd be sent to a re-education camp. The North Vietnamese did this. One of my viewers, he told me about how his family was actually sent to a re-education camp. He's Vietnamese, and he told me on streams how his family was sent to a re-education camp for stuff like this. People were beaten, they were tortured in these camps, they were killed in these camps, and so the North Vietnamese committed a lot of atrocities against their own people, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. I'm not saying that America was perfect. America did commit atrocities like the My Lai massacre. It was horrible massacre that the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War, but I will talk about that more on the next part when I talk about during the Khe Sanh massacre. I'll talk about the My Lai massacre and a lot of this stuff and some of the bad stuff that the U.S. did. So the U.S. isn't perfect. We did bad things. We did horrible things as well. But when people are acting like the communists were like this force for good and they were like liberating, South Vietnam, and they saved like South Vietnam from evil American imperialism, blah, 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 they don't realize how many Vietnamese people lost their livelihoods. They lost everything when the communists had come to power, things that they had worked for their entire lives. We're not talking about like super multi-millionaire people. We're talking about people who had worked with their families, had businesses, had properties that they owned. They lost everything, their livelihoods, their freedoms, and a lot of Vietnamese people ended up coming to America, and Vietnamese Americans are some of those patriotic people and love America. Vietnam today is still under a communist government. Vietnam had actually gone through market reforms, so they had gone through market reforms about like a decade after the Vietnam War, and this basically created free market reforms in Vietnam. So it's kind of similar to China, where it's controlled by the Communist Party. They have free market reforms. Vietnam today is relatively a safe country to visit if you're an American. Like, you don't have to worry about stuff like North Korea, where they're going to kidnap you. But it's there is now freedom of speech in Vietnam today. So you cannot criticize the Communist Party of Vietnam. It's relatively safe to travel to, but it's just, the thing I'll say about that is just be careful what you say if you're ever visiting Vietnam. But that's pretty much it. And also the last thing I wanted to talk about here was the Battle of Khe Sanh, which you're going to see in Black Ops 1. What is going on here exactly? The Battle of Khe Sanh, this was a real battle that happened in 1968, and Khe Sanh was a small outpost of Marines. It was about 6,000 Marines that were there, and it was Marines and also Army of the Republic of South Vietnam. So you had South Vietnamese troops that were there as well. And I wish that Black Ops we would have seen some of the South Vietnamese troops in this game. But anyways, what happened is those this outpost was being attacked by the North Vietnamese. So the North Vietnamese army, they sent a force of over 20,000 soldiers to try to overrun this outpost. And this was like a siege that had lasted for months. And what ended up happening is that the U.S. had claimed that both sides, so both the U.S. and North Vietnam, had claimed victory in the battle. But in my personal opinion, I think it was the U.S. who won that battle, even though both sides are claiming victory. And this isn't my bias as an American. This is just me looking at the fact itself. The North Vietnamese had tried to overrun this outpost, which you're going to see in Black Ops 1 right here. And they had a huge force. They were vastly, they outnumbered the Americans by, nearly 4 times more troops. But the North Vietnamese suffered such high casualties and such high losses, and the U.S. The CIA had claimed that the North Vietnamese had suffered like 15,000 dead, which out of like a force of 20,000, that's not true. The CIA is just only trying to inflate numbers, and I think that the North Vietnamese had only claimed they lost like 2,000 or 3,000 troops in the attack. That's also bullshit. Excuse my language. So both the CIA and the North Vietnamese are lying. The CIA is intentionally, claiming that they had much higher casualties than they did, and the North Vietnamese are downplaying their casualties. So how many North Vietnamese actually died in the battle? The true numbers, we can look at Mac v. SOG's report. So Mac v. SOG, this was actually a special operations group. It was a special forces group. This is what Woods and Mason are part of. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. It was basically special forces in Vietnam. When you think about it, they did special forces operations throughout the Vietnam War. They were disbanded after the Vietnam War. The SOG had basically claimed that the North Vietnamese had suffered over 5,000 casualties, which that's the true number. Because that number was not released until later. So SOG, I believe the SOG numbers over the CIA numbers. I don't believe the CIA numbers where they're claiming it was like 15,000 North Vietnamese. It was around 5,000 North Vietnamese that had died. How many Americans died? In combination with the Americans and the South Vietnamese troops, it was around 500. So when you think about that, 10 times more North Vietnamese died than South Vietnamese and Americans. And the North Vietnamese failed to overrun the outpost. They failed to take the outpost. But why did they claim that it's a victory? The reason that they claim it's a victory was because the U.S. ended up packing up 6 months later and they left the outpost. So there was like skirmishes, here and there since that time. But after the major battle, the U.S. had packed up over the next few months and had gotten the outpost out of there, and they relocated all of their troops out of that area. And so North Vietnam claims, we won this area, the Americans retreated, and we ended up taking the area. But I would not call it a victory, because maybe, the Americans pulled back, but the Americans pulled back to fight another day. This is not comparable to Stalingrad. Like, if you look at a battle like Stalingrad, for example, like in Stalingrad, the way more Germans died than Soviets did, but the Soviets won that battle. And the reason the Soviets won that battle is because they took back their city, where this was just an outpost. They took back their city, but at the same time they trapped the German 6th Army. The German 6th Army was not able to escape, and then they destroyed and captured what was left of the 6th Army. The North Vietnamese, while they might have taken the outpost, they took the outpost after the U.S. had left, and they failed to capture the American soldiers that were there. So they failed to trap and destroy the American force that was there. So I would personally say that it was an American victory, because the heavy casualties that North Vietnam was not able to take the area, and the heavy casualties that they sustained. So the U.S., yes, they left the area, but they got all their troops out of there. So that's personally why I think that it's an American victory. But anyways, let me actually resume playing the game here. So that's me talking like close to an hour about the Vietnam War. So and the Vietnam War I could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, because it's just such a long and complicated history. But I was basically, telling you guys a lot of the stuff that was going on here, and I was trying to, maybe teach you some things that you might not have known about. But, one thing that personally pisses me off about the Vietnam War is, I'm not, some defender of American imperialism, but, like, when I see, like, comments of people acting like the communists were, good guys, or they were, like, liberators in Vietnam, that's a bunch of nonsense. The communists were not good guys.
Grenade! Jesus Christ! God damn it! Let's go! Bye.
Good shot!
Tango down!
Yeah, so this is pretty much what had happened at Khe Sanh, is they were trying to overrun the outpost.
On station, six. Standing by.
Yeah, that would have killed Mason. He was too close to that grenade still.
On the ladder! Check the ladder! He's dead!
Good shot!
Contacts by the trench!
Enemy down! Copy that! Target down! Got him!
He's dead.
Check the ladder!
Incoming.
Move it, Mason!
Adjust your fire.
Come on! Give me cover! Shit! Infantry coming right at us! We gotta land a napalm barrel from 20 yards out! Just hit this! Some guys you mind, Mason. Local forces love them. Here they come, Mason!
God damn it.
Wait for it!
Mayday, mayday. Jesus Christ.
Now! Get the stragglers!
Enemy by
Hold
the
that
trench!
position! Burn them, Mason!
This part's a little difficult to get through because, yeah, see that? They'll just constantly keep running all around.
Enemy trench!
Not yet! Come on, Jack! Shit, too early! They're still coming! Fall back! Fall back!
Ah, damn. I was waiting for Woods' signal, but they were just all over me there.
Not yet! Blow it, Mason! Good kill! Come on, shoot the wall! Right, to a right! Take that! Hey! Hung lại hướng đường! Rõ! Ta thấy á! Thấy tôi lo! Tập trung đi! Tôi thấy chúng rồi! Bên kia! Ta thấy đó! Enemy by the trench! Theo dõi mục tiêu! Có rồi! Tango, left hill! He's dead!
Target down!
Tango on the right hill.
Got eyes on him!
Out of the way! Shit! We get
here
armor
come the
moving up.
NVA
Russian
tanks, yep.
T-55s. We need something bigger. On me! Russian tanks! No wonder they're getting bold! Here, this law rocket will burst them wide open.
Wait till the tanks get a little closer.
Grab that law, Mason!
Enemy trench!
I see him! Target down! Got it!
Sandbag line, contact!
I got him!
Grab some cover! Hostiles, left hill!
Right hill, contact.
In the trench, contact!
Confirmed!
Movement on the left hill!
All over him!
Enemy trench!
Got eyes on him!
There we go.
Runner is inbound. 2 minutes, please stand by.
We're out of time!
Enemy down!
Be advised, Red Rider on station. Keep your head down. Place coordinates on target. Have a nice day, Red Rider out.
Left hill contact! Take me!
Damn, yeah, I forgot how
Enemy
ridiculous
down.
this mission is. And also,
Left hill!
this is the worst mission on Veteran, in my opinion, on this game. The worst one.
In the valley!
Because there's so many enemies coming from so many directions.
Enemy down! Copy!
Right hill!
I got him! Check the hill on the right! Got eyes on him! Shit! The bastards ain't letting up!
Play. 10 minutes out.
This is the worst part, this one. I remember this
We're
one.
almost out of ammo. There's a weapons
cache in that bunker on the right.
Damn! On fuel.
But we can't get to it. They closed our right flank.
Those barrels are full of napalm?
Yeah!
Negative.
push back before we can bury him.
Good to know. Marines, hold your positions. Let's fucking go.
Near the trench line!
Rip them up!
This mission, the reason this is the worst part on Veteran, I'm playing on Hardened, by the way, we're not on Veteran, but the reason this part sucks the worst in the game is because the enemies aren't infinite on this part. They will not stop spawning, so you have to push down the hill.
Tango down!
Enemy down.
You have to push through enemies that are constantly spawning.
Trench line, movement!
No Fagagi line to hold them back this time. Now, Mason, do it. Let's light these bastards up.
Mike, yeah, see that? That's what I'm playing on Hardened. So literally, the Veteran, this is the worst, but...
Shit!
Six Red Rider! What's your position? Just hang tight. Okay, standing by. Go, go, go!
Target down!
Oh yeah, this part is really annoying.
Roger. You like to eat. Hostiles at the trench line.
On the barrels! Enemy down. Reloading, cover me!
No Fagagi line to hold them back this time. Now, Mason, do it. Let's light these bastards up. We need to improvise, Mason. Trench line, movement!
Enemy down!
We need more.
Enemy down!
Hostiles at the trench line. Move grenade!
Near the trench line! On the barrels!
Trench line, movement! They're making another push! Southeast side! That should hold them.
Ooh, okay, there we go. We pushed them back.
Those are our own mortars! They don't know we're here! Toward the HQ!
Get up the hill!
Oh man, it's I'm sorry, I'm messing up a bunch on this mission. It's just this like I said, this is the worst mission on Veteran.
Those are our own mortars! They don't know we're here! Toward the HQ!
Why that stuff?
Enemies by the stump! Contact down! Confirmed!
Keep your head down!
Move on!
Crap. Yep. Oh man, yeah, this. Oh, and I got a checkpoint too. But at least I got a checkpoint. But even on hardened, this mission is so difficult. But veteran, it's.
Enemies! Try to stop! Got him!
Hostile near that crater!
Follow! Target down! Confirm! The HQ bunker! Target down! Contact HQ bunker!
I hear you.
I can barely even push up.
Grab some cover! Enemies! Try to stop! Frag out! Contact down! Tango! Crater! He's down! Stop! Confirmed! The HQ bunker! Target down!
Hostile near that crater! Tango crater! In the crater!
Keep pushing!
Garnoy!
That right there, you see a perfect example of the M16 in Vietnam. The M16 is a great rifle. One of the reasons that the M16 had jamming issues is because a lot of the M16s were not equipped with cleaning kits when they first issued them. Any gun that's not equipped with a cleaning kit, if you don't clean it, it's going to jam regardless. Even an AK-47's jammed.
Repeat your last.
On me!
More NVA moving in! Infantry and armor! They must have a fucking division hit out there!
And I thought he was a pussy. Now that's what I'm talking about. Jumping back, get on the toe.
This thing's built like a tank.
Yeah, but a damn sight more maneuverable.
VF-143, authorization Sierra Oscar Golf X-ray. Priority 1 ordnance to my command.
Affirmative, X-ray. Engaging.
Use the controls to steer the tow missile.
Arc light, 5 minutes VF-143 in.
Nice.
Arc
Enemy on
light,
the hill.
2 minutes out. Nice shot!
Thank you.
At the front line!
I got him.
Tango, on the road! Affirmative, X-ray. Engaging.
Keep it up.
Affirmative, X-ray. Engaging.
Ain't over yet.
Arc light, 1 minute out. Roger, X-ray. Coming in for strafing run. Understood, X-ray. Commencing run.
Downhill by the trend line. Good hit. Contact on the hill. He felt that one.
Roger that. We're inbound. Arc light. Coordinates confirmed. Engaging.
It's over.
No. This is the start of something else. They'll be back.
Oh, and unfortunately, I gotta cut the music again, because it's Bowman's helicopter is about to give me a copyright claim.
4014.
Bowman! You look like hammered shit, Mason.
Would Nama do that to you?
Good to see you, Alex.
Jason Hudson, CIA. We're here to talk about your encounter with Russians in Laos. We got word a defector might be in play.
Yep.
Today, communications are in chaos, and commercial flights from the airport have been canceled.
Okay, so I guess
The Tet Offensive was the beginning of the end, when America really started losing the war. Inside the MACV compound in Way City, you established.
Okay, guys, so we will wrap it up here. I will have the Battle of Hue City next on the next part. So thank you guys, and I'll talk about the Hue City battle on the next part, as well as some more history. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you guys on the next one. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, guys.